Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Bucky Inspired series, and I'm honored to have Curt McNamara back. This is the third chapter of his book, and we're going to be talking about design science today. So Curt, the floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you, Shrikant, and everyone. So, yeah. This is the third installment of a summary of the book I'm writing on Bucky's ideas. As with all interesting projects, it never goes exactly how you thought, but it's very good. When I got in the material, I realized really if I was going to talk about Bucky's ideas on design, because the book title is Bucky for Designers, and designers has a small d, because we all design. And if you review the previous meetups, you'll see some discussion of that. So it seemed clear I had to cover comprehensive anticipatory design science. And so the first one, we talked about comprehensivity, and a key thing that we did was to use Bucky's ideas to enhance existing design practice. So there's a design practice called design thinking, and another one, this one's more of a tool called rich pictures. Another sort of a tool called systems mapping, and several related ones. And so what we did in that presentation was say, okay, here are some existing methods that people use. You could use them for your own little d design projects, and they're often used for those, big D design projects. And how would Bucky's view on comprehensivity enhance those? So that was the first one. The second one was on anticipatory, and it was pointed out that Bucky was one of the first futurists, and a key point of that was design is a futures activity. When we design, we're doing something not for today, but for tomorrow, next year, next whatever, right? And so then anticipatory really is an aspect of design. But in particular, if we looked at Bucky's philosophy of design and the reason to participate or engage in comprehensive anticipatory design science was to enhance living, which is, the betterment of people, as well as the maintenance or enhancement of all the living systems. And so then a big piece of anticipatory was to help us realize that when we do design and we're looking in the future, we're particularly aware of the natural and living systems around us, so that what we do is in tune with those, because it's so easy nowadays to just say, oh, I'll just get this material from here and that part from there, and I'll stick them together and I'll sell it to you and we're done. And of course, that's not doing something in line with living systems. And we talked about circular design. All right. So then that brought us to month 3. Well, on our waltz around the tetrahedron of comprehensive anticipatory design science, we had design, which we could have done by itself, but it turns out that Bucky kind of very rarely used the term by itself, but he often used design science. So this month, tonight, we're talking about design science, and in particular, what is it? So there's a lot of aspects to it, a lot of views of it, and I'm interested in what you think about all this. What have you thought about design science? Hearing what we have here tonight, what seemed interesting, what do you want to know more about, what isn't clear, etc. So I would say that there's multiple aspects to design science. So first of all, I'd say it's really the design method overall, right, of comprehensive anticipatory design science. Really, design science by itself encompasses the method, and more on that in a minute. Clearly, it's the set of generalized principles, and we'll delve into that a little bit. And of course, when we read, just Bucky in the original, we're often thinking about, well, yeah, the equations of physics and biology and chemistry, clearly that's really key. But Bucky discovered quite a number of generalized principles, and those are ones where, once again, knowing about Bucky can enhance people's process. The subtitle of Synergetics is the geometry of nature. And that was his goal, is how does nature, how are things put together? It was very clear to Bucky that we don't live in a cubical world, right? You walk out in nature, you do not see, cubes everywhere. You walk into your house, you see them, you live in cubes, right? And right angles and what we call the Cartesian, XYZ coordinate system. Nature isn't that way. And he was very clear that by signing up for these, what he would call mathematical illusions, which were things like points and lines and planes that went off to infinity, and the idea that somehow XYZ coordinate system was the basis of nature, is wrong. It led us down the wrong path. It led us down a path where we believed that these manufactured, very useful. I mean, there's a lot of benefit from being able to use the ideas of points, lines, and planes, right? We can manipulate things very easily. But if we start to believe that's reality, now we're lost, because we're now designing in this other world, this fantastical world that we've made up by ourselves, that exists only in our brain. In a way, well, we express it, of course, in our designs, but it's not an expression directly of nature. And he was very clear that that was the basis for many of the issues we had of not working in tune with nature, not being efficient, and etc. So we'll talk a little bit about biomimicry and Bucky's ideas in the geometry of nature. And then finally, a term that's often brought up is the design science revolution. And once again, what does this mean to people? What does it bring to mind? And I think, many of us have this idea that, oh my gosh, yep, this is going to happen. It's going to transform society. We'll do things the right way, spontaneous cooperation, doing more with less, really a revolution in society. And so the question is, well, how much that has happened and what's remaining? And I guess, what can we do? Okay, so maybe move a little faster now. So then I always like to start with, what did Bucky say? And so from everything I know, 42 hours that Bucky put together towards the end of his life, they're up on the Buckminster Fuller website again. The transcripts are there. There's actually a PDF file with all the transcripts together, so you can search one single source to find all the stuff. And so then this is directly from that. And we've looked at this before. And, the definitions of design science are fairly straightforward. The one I want to emphasize is sort of the intent, that he put behind defining design science and encouraging us to follow it, which is our increasing intuition and obligation to use the principles on behalf of all humanity and on behalf of the total integrity of the universe, like the living natural systems we're part of. All right. So now I also like to use Bill Perk's definition. And so this was from the Buckminster Fuller website, where they have many definitions of design science. And I like his words there: design using your imagination, intentionally create positive alternatives. So this is a key difference between Bucky's use of design science, and just sort of generic design, right? that we're doing this not just because we can make $1, right? Because it's cool. We're doing design deliberately because we're going to make life better for humans and all living systems. All right. So then this is that cover page from BFI, and you can go and look, and there's probably at least 30. And it's interesting because some of these people are no longer with us. And they asked them how to define CADs and what's the relevance and what do you consider to be highest priorities. So, take a look. So now here are a couple of entries from the Synergetics Dictionary that's online. And if you Google Synergetics Dictionary, R.W. Gray, it'll pop up. And it's kind of an odd interface. You have to just jump around by hand. You can't really search it. But here's a couple of entries on design science. The grand strategy, going from the whole to the particular. Well, it's our comprehensive stuff, right? How do we treat all of it without leaving anything out? And then he goes into specifics of the actual design science generalized principles that he's found. And then in the lower one, once again, you get this focus on doing the best thing, the best way you can. At the last sentence, how to do so much with so little as to render all humanity economically and physiologically successful. And this was essentially ephemeralization, a term he came up with, I don't know when, but it's pervasive now, right? Yeah, all the digital economy is all ephemeralization. What the sustainability people call transmaterialization is ephemeralization. So just one of his many ideas that when people say, well, what did Bucky do? They just don't realize we're living and breathing Bucky. All right, and then if we jump into synergetics, and so this is section 165, and once again, if you Google synergetics R.W. Gray, you'll find both books together, all the figures, a combined index. And so this is the generalized design science exploration. So this is slightly different, right? So we're going out and we're going to try and see the what of the what. So highlighting a couple of key things, our consciously competent participation in local evolutionary transformation. This comes up again and again. What's happening right now, right here with us, and how can we engage with it fully, and how can we engage with it using nature's principles? When we create an artifact, we're looking at sort of what he called specific longevity solutions. Like this is going to work for this time frame, and then of course it'll return to natural systems. Once again, living systems coming up, ever increasing, effectively concern for the relevant ecological intercomplementation. And then in the last one, eternally regenerative generalized universe. So I think you can see that there's a real consistency in this, right? And that consistency really emphasized living in tune with nature. If we were to go off right now and say, well, how have we done? Like the book club is right now reading Utopia or Oblivion, which was written in the late 60s, early 70s, I want to say. And he talks about, progress humanity has made. And you go and look at like our world in data and all the other things about life expectancy, child mortality. We've done amazing work, right? I mean, there's still, of course, millions, if not billions of people that don't have everything, but on a percentage basis, all the parameters are much, much better. What's wrong, of course, is that we've done it on the back of the ecosystem, right? On top of an extractive economy that's now put everything at risk, right? Our existence, all kinds of species, et cetera, et cetera. So we forgot the part, right? We were having so much fun. We were so good at making the stuff, right? That we just forgot that it all had to come back to nature somehow. So now we're in this other phase. All right. So then this is the design science planning process. This is from the design science primer that Menard, Gable, and Howard Brown put together to codify Bucky's process. And it's part of what was at the time called Design Science Lab. It's now the Global Solutions Lab. And it's a fairly straightforward process. You choose your challenge, and what are you going to look at? And then you define this preferred state. That's your anticipatory one, right? where you're working in the future. And Bucky always liked to work decades ahead if he could, right? He said it was much easier to work that way than for tomorrow. And then you describe the present state. And then you start to think, well, what is the system in the future that we're going to need, right? And how are we going to evaluate it? How are we going to look at the alternatives? And then you proceed along with it. So it's a fairly general design process. This would not be too surprising to anybody that was in design practice. I think, I guess maybe the difference is the emphasis on defining the preferred state that's out there before we start, and also inventorying the present state. Many of them are more like, well, here's a challenge and the stakeholder state's important. So there we go, bang, we're off, right? They don't often or always consider the futures aspect of it. And some things are better than others. Systems engineering does a pretty good job of that. So let's just say that you're in this process, the design or science process, and Bucky would say, what should you be aware of? You've gone through the comprehensive exercise now, which means you've tuned in, right? You've ignored the systems that are larger and slower, but you're aware of them, right? You've gone from the whole to the particular. And you're also aware of the smaller systems within everything, the modules within us or with any situation. You're saying, yes, it's this kind of a challenge we have sort of at this, it's on a time scale of months, and it includes, humans interacting and that sort of thing. Then he would say, well, what are the strategies, the things you should be aware of as you work forward towards a solution? And so you start in the upper right. So the problem formulation, comprehensive, as we said, to the particulars, tuning in, being aware of synergy, the fact that systems always exhibit behaviors unpredicted by the parts. Mathematical structuring. This is sort of the Bucky's way of describing space and systems. Geographical reconnaissance, being aware of what's going on around you, as well as what the Earth in general is doing right now, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is a good list of things to have if we're going to engage in a comprehensive design science process, right? We should either go out and look at these, or I think Bucky actually spent time, especially with his team, tracking all of these. And so this is one of the things that was interesting to me when I thought about Bucky's life. He was one of the very, very few people that would spend his time just being completely aware of all that was going on and how it could be used for the betterment, right? So he's got his, I suppose maybe nowadays he'd have an AI, or if you could trust it, right? Gathering information about, geographical stuff, or you'd have interns or something. And so you'd have this library continually updated with all the latest stuff, so that when you went forward, you'd know what was there. So then it's worthwhile mentioning that there are a couple of or more places currently practicing hands-on design science. Bernard Gable has had the Design Science Lab, now Global Solutions Lab, for decades. And if you go to his website, you can see nice books full of past solutions. He brings in teams of people, students and others, to work together. He engages with the UN, just a remarkable amount of stuff. And then Peter Meissen, who has been at these meetups before, and he read Critical Path, I believe, way back when it came out, and said, oh my gosh, the most important thing is the worldwide electric grid. So he put his life towards that for decades. But a few years ago, he realized that there's now so much awareness of the necessity of interconnecting the grid that GENI wasn't going to be as useful anymore. GENI, that was his Global Electrical Network Interconnect or something. And so he's changed his focus towards the World Resource Simulation Centers. So this is from his webpage, and it shows the previous slide that would flow through would show a sort of a war room or a space room, right, tracking somebody in space. And this is a business boardroom. But what he does is he has a setup where you can roll in, a dozen large format screens. He has all the data in the world to look at. You'll get a team of people to look at their locality and then use all these resources to figure out some of the possibilities. So this is kind of exactly what Bucky was doing, right? Is getting the people together and giving them access to all the data. So this is current stuff that's happening. But then what about Bucky? What was his design science lab? Well, it's interesting. I don't know if we have too many images or too many definitions. We know the stuff he worked with because it's in synergetics. We're aware of the models he created because he documented them quite well. So the question is, oh, and I should mention too that Bucky spent time documenting what he called his self-disciplines, and I kind of riffed on that a little bit. I think was when we were doing the big idea stuff for the BFI website. I said, well, and what else do we get out of reading his books and stuff? And so Bucky's philosophy would include things like thinking for yourself, which is don't accept the line and the point and the plane, right? If you know that the polyhedral shapes are what really exists and the other stuff doesn't. And part of this is what he called operational mathematics. It's not his term. It was a term created, I guess, around the turn of the 20th century. But the idea is you don't necessarily use anybody else's ideas on the work. You just go directly with what's available in situation at hand. And Bucky keenly observed that Einstein did that when he developed theories of relativity. He was specifically focused on only the stuff that was relevant in the situation at hand. And I think you know the rest of these and they would make sense to you. So what am I suggesting so far? That you are all design scientists, already you are. And as you become more aware of it and more aware of the resources, you're going to be more effective. And so the question is, what shall we do, right? And so once again, synergetics from the very beginning, why aren't we demanding a design science revolution? Why aren't we all working towards this, sustainable physical success of people in all nature? And why aren't we totally focused on nature being 100% regenerative? So as you can see, I'm kind of giving you this overview of design science, what it meant to Bucky, all the aspects of it, and how he would have used it, right? He would be using his intent, his self-disciplines, his strategies of looking at different aspects, and then decision of working, for all. So here's the quiz question to start with. And feel free to just start taking some notes on the side. It's okay to put something in chat. We'll bring it up after the presentation. But what would your design science lab have in it? We saw Bucky's, a lot of modeling stuff, right? And lots of paper, so he could make notes and sketches and communicate to people. And, for a number of us, we've got, some sort of modeling stuff we play with, right? We have a member of the book club who's into body work, and well, his design science lab probably has sort of the latest information on yoga and other body practices, maybe biotensegrity, right? How biological systems are really tensegrities. They're combinations of tension and compression. So those would be things that he would use, and maybe a place for him to explore different movements or teach people. That would be his design science lab. So you do have one. You may not think of it that way, and you could always do more, right? And so I'm encouraging everybody to think about what their lab would look like and putting a little energy towards creating that. So yeah, we'll come back with that later. So now, when Bucky coined the term, this wasn't on anybody's radar. And I don't know who did this. If it was one of you, thank you. It was brilliant. But it finally got into Wikipedia. That design science was the term that he created. And, we've already mentioned that there are several aspects to it. But if you just take the words by themselves, you come up with two combinations: a science of design, and that's what this Wikipedia article focuses on, and then, of course, the design of science. So we talk about the science of design. Herbert Simon, who actually turned out to be the only non-economist to get the Nobel Prize in economics for explaining what's called satisficing. And so economics, up to the point where Simon made this distinction, said that we were all rational players. Like if gas was 10 cents cheaper 3 miles away, we were going to go get gas over there. But when we actually observe people, we don't do this. We have all kinds of factors in play. And there's a whole bunch of books in this now, right? Behavioral economics, irrational, economics, et cetera. It just means that there's and those are kind of poor terms, but it means that there's the human aspect to all of it. And Simon defined this as what he called satisficing, that we've got an equation, it's got multiple terms, and the raw cost is one thing, but it's not the only thing. And that's a much better model for how people operate. So anyway, that was Simon. And so then he's mentioned in the Wikipedia article, and then he's, and a quote I grabbed just by him saying that, and you know what, we aren't really teaching this. We aren't teaching the science of design. And so design science has become a huge, huge deal. So here's an open access journal of design science. And you can see really cool stuff, you guys. I recommend you go Google Design Science Journal and check a few things. And so what I would say is that this form of design science, by being the science of design, will tell us how to make a correct design. We won't make errors, right? We'll have a chance of moving towards optimality, but there is no value basis for it, right? Once again, using this science of design, you could be making widgets to make a buck, or you could be making killingery, and design, this aspect of this instantiation or whatever, this version of design science would be like, well, yeah, you made it right. You did good. Where Bucky was really clear, well, no, we don't use design science to make widgets or make killingery. We use it to enhance people's lives and restore nature. So that's a first thing just to recall. And then a second thing that this current version of design science misses is a grounding in generalized principles. There's an assumption that you've learned, the appropriate ones from your discipline, right? That you know about electrical engineering and how to do filtering and control and things like that. And, so those generalized principles are sort of a given, for a designer, that that, so they're not mentioned. But they don't mention the overall generalized principles that Bucky pointed out. And we're going to talk about those in a minute, for things like systems and the shape of nature. So there's another fairly big piece. Okay, and then obviously there's also a science or design of science. And I would say that the design of science has a lot of overlap with overall, the comprehensive anticipatory design science process. In particular, though, Bucky's focus on operational mathematics might be a bit of a difference between the two of them. Excuse me. All right. So as I mentioned before, if we were to have our design science wiki put together, and I hope we do, I got the domain name reserved for it, just like Integrity Wiki. So I think if we get a project going to create a design science wiki, we could have lists of the design principles found in different fields. So for example, in biology, are you well aware of allometry and morphology and how respiration and various other processes work, right? Anabolic and catabolic, do you know what these things mean? These are very useful outside of biology. So there's a lot we can learn by just getting the basics without getting any in-depth degree. So this is just useful to design sciences. But then there's the generalized principles of synergetics. OMG, there's a bunch of them, aren't there? So we've talked in the past about systems change, and we could talk about that tonight, but we don't have time. But we're going to talk a bit about systems, what Bucky told us about systems, and we're gonna glance briefly at the geometry of nature, or what he taught us about shape and how the nature would exhibit that. And the left side, there's just a bunch of topics that we'll have to see if there's room in the book to put all of them in. So then, what did he tell us about systems? Well, the simplest system has 4 elements or nodes. Well, how is that possible? Because it's the simplest thing that divides space into 2, right? It's got a boundary, it's got an insideness and an outsideness. So therefore, systems must have at least 4 nodes and must have closure in what we call 3 space. Whatever set of coordinate systems for it doesn't matter, but we have that. And then he emphasized, though, we tend to focus on the nodes or the corners, but he emphasized that really it's all about the relations, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And where a system is found? Everywhere. So the bicycle, in and of itself is a complex system. The parts of a bicycle are subsystems. Use of a bicycle is a systemic thing, and it enables all kinds of things like cultural practices, economic transfers, exercise. It intersects with all kinds of stuff. So systems are everywhere around us. So then, excuse me, if we look in synergetics at the simplest system of a tetrahedron, he pointed out that Plato's triad of truth, beauty, and symmetry couldn't be a system because it only had 3 elements. But he correctly, I think, said what's missing the observer. So if you put the self in it, now you have a system. And now it makes sense, right? Because the self is what would perceive the truth or the beauty or the symmetry. And once you put it in this form, you realize that every element has a relationship to the others as well. So that's a very, maybe his most basic, simple example. Now, I did some work with this later on, and I said there's a lot of these diagrams that are shown as a circle, right? And one you may have heard of is the OODA, observed, or orient, observe, decide, and act, and then you kind of repeat around it. Peter Senge, who is a systems thinker, system dynamics person, said there was a similar one about learning, and he also put it in the circle. And I said, well, really, though, I think it's more of a tetrahedron of learning, because each of these things, like deciding, isn't just always in this linear progression of one step to the next, right? It's going to interconnect with reflecting and connecting, etc. And so, yeah. So one thing that we can do is start to imagine everything we look at that's a process in terms of this activity, this closure in 3 space, minimum 4 nodes, and then what do these connections mean? So those connections, in the past, we didn't really define the connection between deciding and reflecting, right? And Bucky would say, well, that's the most important thing. You can define the nodes, but they're only there, right? Because the relations come together to create a node. So then what are the relations? Well, they tend to be forces or fields. Well, what are forces or fields? Oh my gosh, we don't know, right? As Bucky said, gravity isn't in the parts, it's between the parts, right? And but relations might be what we sometimes call energy, material, or information. So they could be potentials or actual flows, kinetic flows. They could represent pipes, they could be fuzzy, and then there could be attributes to them like the lower left, right? They could go in one direction only, or actually, I think in most cases, when 2 things are connected together, there's actually 2 connections, more like a concertity, right? One going, one coming. And then the actual relation may not be continuous. It may be switched on and off, or pulsed, or modulated. So I think you understand at this point that anybody who thinks they know about a particular field, if they took enough time to understand what Bucky was talking about minimal systems and relations, would come to a much greater understanding of how their things are put together and how they could change them. So this is a huge, huge part of generalized principles. And then we've already touched on this, but of course the universe is the combination of the physical, all the stuff we see, and the metaphysical, which are the laws and generalized principles that tell us how things can combine and evolve and etc. So then we are physical polyhedra ourselves, right? And we're also metaphysical polyhedra. So all of us have interests that we go out and look and acquire information, we exchange to learn more, to participate in discussions, to go into activities. And so then we can think of ourselves as a polyhedra, and then the nodes, there's a particular node that's just, let's say that's, my node of, excess Bucky knowledge, there's sort of too much for me just to sort of not sit and talk to people about it. So it just kind of spews out. And if I'm lucky, right, there's some other polyhedral systems nearby that say, well, sure, I'll listen to you, talk about Bucky knowledge for a while, and we'll have an exchange. And so that's also useful to think yourselves that way. Especially, when you're thinking this job sucks, right? And of course the workplace is taking something for you, and and the something is an ability or some energy or something you do, and of course it's exchanging money in a way for you to exist, but often it's not an entirely satisfactory exchange. And so then to think about maybe what other needs and what other modes of expression you have and how they aren't being satisfied could help you modify things. All right. And anyway, this idea on every man as a polyhedron comes from this Atkin in his book, Mathematical Structure and Human Affairs. And so, yeah, just a couple of ideas about this. I used this in a Bucky class I ran years ago. So, yeah, and we could go into this, but systems are metaphysical as well as physical. Okay, and then, oops. So then generalized principles of space, well, you've heard from Stroopy, you've heard from Kirby, right? You've heard from Casey. And so what you've heard about is, of course, the stuff that Bucky spent a lot of time looking at, which is the cubocahedron, the vector equilibrium, the 12 degrees of freedom, the space filling stuff, the mathematical basis for how nature comes together. And I would say that's great. However, there's also this really simple thing starting with a tetrahedron, right? And systems coupling together, and this idea that inside every system is other systems. So if you took a tetrahedron and you divide the sides in half, I have a model here somewhere. Where did it go? When you connect up those midpoints, you've actually got an octahedron inside your tetrahedron. And it's pretty cool. I'll find it for the discussion and bring it up. So I won't go much into this because you had some already really excellent presentations on it. I'll just emphasize that if that all seems a bit much, or even if it doesn't, it's really useful to just start to think about the really simple stuff like the tetrahedral stuff. And how useful is it? So if you look over the tetrahedron, you'll see an entry called meshes. So it turns out that when we model what are called electromagnetic fields, and of course, those are what our cell phones use and what we use for telecommunications. When we model them, we don't use XYZ cubical models. It doesn't make sense. It's very inefficient. We use tetrahedra, irregular ones that we can size appropriately for the level scale we want. And so all electromagnetic modeling software that I'm aware of uses tetrahedral meshes. In a similar way, now the move is afoot for what was called finite element models, which are computer models that let us simulate things like bridges and planes and stresses and strains. They're also kind of all moving towards tetrahedral meshes. So even just spending time with a tetrahedron, right? So what does that mean? It means you can model yourself as a bunch of tetrahedrons, or your community organization, or your whatever. And by putting them together, you're going to learn a lot, and you don't need to spend a lot of time, becoming a visualizer, but you can. And of course, I should mention VZome. I don't think I have an image in this presentation, but VZome is actually a fairly easy way to put together models that are using essentially Zome tool components. I'll show you a Zome tool image here shortly. Okay, so then I mentioned biomimicry, biology, and connections. And if you're like, well, geez, what did Bucky say about that? I mean, all of his stuff seems so static and fixed. And I think that's a challenge with synergetics in general, and maybe geometry in general, as we think of it as because we draw a picture and we try and analyze it statically. But Bucky emphasized over and over again, it's dynamic. These things snap in and out of existence like in femtoseconds, right? Like quarks basically have tetrahedral structures that come and go just like, so fast. So then Dan Airy Friedman, who's part of the Trim Tab Book Club, was kind enough to put together just a whole bunch of links to current biological research and things related to synergetics. And so if you go up to the big ideas section of the website of bfi.org and look at biology, you're going to find stuff that's going to blow your mind on how much stuff there is out there. So tons of stuff there. Of course, during his life, he was always pleased when it turned out that the latest discovery of a virus, for example, was going to be icosahedral or whatever it was. This one actually is from another presentation where I was emphasizing that we could also start mapping Bucky's ideas as patterns, like Alexander's pattern language, and it might help people understand them. So in patterns, we say, well, what's the context that we're finding this sort of solution? And what are the conflicting forces that are present? And so an example from architecture is a door. So a door is a pattern, and the context is a house or a building. The conflicting forces are you keep some things out, right, like the bugs, and keep other things in, like maybe the people or the little kids. And of course, you can move it, and doors are a generalized principle. There's fancy doors that open when you walk up to them, and there's the door in your house, which is much simpler, and there's doors on Bedouin huts, right? There's doors on teepees in Native American. So doors are just everywhere. And so anyway, same we could do with Bucky. So there's a whole nother project, we could get going. So anyway, I worked on this for a while at one point because I also do work in biomimicry, education. And I was like, well, so let's do kind of like Bucky did and sort of take this down to, the basics. And, how does nature, and then I said, sense or filter or change. Now, you go to asknature.org, and you can actually ask these questions, like how does nature filter, and you'll be amazed at what they've put together for you, because they'll have found organisms that explain the strategy, and you can then generalize it and take it back and use it in your design work and create better and more efficient stuff. And so that you can do. And then I thought, but let's, how fine can we go, on the detail of how nature works? And so how about diverge versus converge? Nature diverges all the time, doesn't it? And so then, many people are aware now of all the work going on about fungal networks and how they connect to tree roots, and how there's this symbiotic relationship where the fungal network can acquire different minerals that the tree needs but can't get. And then in return, the tree gives it energy like sucrose, and how the trees are actually connected together. There's a great book called The Mother Tree by Susan Simard. And so, excuse me, nature kind of builds this, right, little bit by little bit, okay, these fractalish structures. Well, and here's more examples. This is from Alexander's Nature of Order. He's just showing how spirals and other forms, fractal forms, form in nature. And I guess I have one more, Holdrich's, and he's showing development of plants. And so once again, these are all described very well by things like the irregular tetrahedra that David Koski is working with. And so you can see three of them together here, and the three are scaled by what's called phi. And phi is one of those magic numbers that sort of describes how, the next element in a sunflower spiral relates to the last element. It's a scaling factor. It's what's in the golden rectangle and things that are very pleasing to us. And so then David Koski just said, well, what if we applied phi to these quantum modules that Bucky described? What would we be able to do? Well, as you can see, you start to create spirals, and they're very much like natural. So this is all just super connected, you guys, and it's a huge opportunity for people to look and explore. And I guess what I'm saying is the possibility to give them a mathematical grounding, a visual grounding, 3D grounding in what they're looking at, in addition to their equations. And Bucky, of course, loved this. He said that, one of the reasons science has gone so far afield is that now it's all equations. If you don't read the equations, you don't understand it. But once you have a visual model, anybody can understand it. So then there's so much here. Precession, he often described precession as, the effect of one system on another. And in particular, he liked the example of the pollinator flying into the flower. And when it did, it picked up pollen, and then it transferred that to the next flower. So now you have more flowers, and that helps create habitat for more pollinators. Well, if you actually look and zoom in at what pollen grains look like and what the surface properties of pollinators look like, you're going to be at a whole nother level of scale of systems coupling and precession. And of course, this is a co-evolutionary process, not necessarily designed, but optimized, I guess, over millennia to make this happen. And so this is just found over and over again. So what does this give a biologist or somebody in biology? Once again, an easy way to understand these sort of exchanges and couplings and ability to, describe it, and also to create better things in the future, right? To move away, to be able to say, well, wait a minute, this design is strictly extractive. This design doesn't return anything to nature, right? There's only these one-way transfers. This is not going to be sustainable. We need to figure this out. So some very, very simple stuff. Excuse me. Trim tabs, which are often talked about, are just straight out of nature, right? The wingtips and the feathers on the wingtips of birds are trim tabs. They just move them a little bit and they're all over. What are called the tubercles and the scallops on the edges of whale flippers are trim tabs all over throughout nature. So what am I saying is there's basic design science, generalized principles that can complement what you would get through a standard education when you thought you knew everything about, particular, species interaction. You could actually rethink and relook at it by using these simple principles of Bucky's. All right, I'm sort of wrapping up, I think. Excuse me. So what about this design science revolution? Well, he said it was this comprehension of total cosmic technology. And by that, he meant nature's technology. He said our technology is lame, but nature has beautiful technology. We comprehended that a competent design revolution, would render all of us and the living systems that surround us physically and metaphysically successful. And that over time, if we did it, it would turn out that our function in universe would be to do things like that, right? Would be to act to restore ecosystems, to act to help people realize their full capabilities and not have the needs they have. So that's what he said it really was. And it's all around us. It's kind of happened once again, and we weren't really totally aware of it. So I would say that good examples from the upper left for design science revolution would be wikis, video tutorials, open source, social innovations, pattern languages. There's a bunch of methods already in practice. There's a whole bunch of resources available for it. There's principles of it. And it's in all kind of areas already. And I could go and give you a bunch of organizations that work on it. So then, where are we at with design science? Well, we talked about the design science revolution. Well, there's a lot to be done yet, right? We got to figure out the climate thing. Just, that's the first thing, right? And obviously I've indicated areas in science that could gain from it. There are actually different resources available even without us creating the wiki. The ideas of futures are ubiquitous. I mean, it's just something that's totally absorbed and is no longer even associated with Bucky. And there's a bunch of great future projects here, right? Besides the wiki, what I'll call design science toolboxes to allow you to more easily grasp these things and use them. Some kind of an app for comprehensivity of tuning in and figuring out what's what. Some way of coming up with maybe better models for our futures thinking and more inspirational pieces of it. And more and more stuff. And then, of course, there's challenges, right? That's okay. There's deep research to be done. And I guess, what you learn when you study people who are dedicated to learning is they always have their time for research. They don't assume they know everything, and that everything that they need to know is actually known. And so it's not always opening a book and figuring it out. It's, guess what? Sitting at that design science laboratory once again, right? And so we can all benefit from spending an hour or two a week saying, well, what are the challenges? And I'll just say the one is this idea of relations. What are these relations? And then what happens when they come together at this corner of a polyhedra, right? Somehow they don't balance out because there's always some extra that comes off, right? But somehow they interact. Well, what does that interaction look like? Could I draw a diagram of these things here? How would I do that? So there's some fairly deep stuff that remains, which doesn't require a lot of equipment. And, could be simple examples. I had something I did one time trying to figure out how the flame in a furnace, could be modeled like this. And it's super complicated, So, but, you all know enough about physics to actually just go and do that, right? Without hardly looking anything up. So anyway, there's a lot of challenges and possibilities. And so beyond what I'm suggesting today as possibilities I've explained to you, we all have the chance, and I hope you'll all, like I said, you'll have your own design science lab, and you'll start to do a little research, and you'll dig into these topics and come back and share it with the rest of us. And that was it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Curt. Folks, this is going to be very interactive. So please, would love to hear your comments, your questions, anything that you have. This is collaborative. It's an amazing set of people here. So would love to hear from everybody what they thought. You can make comments, you can ask questions, anything that you want. Go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom, whatever you prefer. We're going to start with Mona. Mona, go ahead.
Yes, hi. I wanted to thank you for the presentation first. I kept thinking about it. You mentioned biology and all these elements of design that have to do with nature, like the trees and the viruses and all the structure that's geometrical. But I'm thinking more in terms of relational, like say ecology. You mentioned ecology briefly, but I want to bring it up in a different way. Say, for instance, what would require to restore ecological balance, maybe measures that are unsavory, like trophic cascade is a term that comes to mind. Like when the wolves were reintroduced in Yellowstone, that caused a whole bunch of changes to happen naturally. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to see how is that now, or if that is captured at all in this design system.
I think it has great potential. In fact, I had a slide that showed, so one way of modeling ecological systems is called system dynamics, which is stock and flow. And Howard Odum is somebody who had his own version of it. Systems Ecology was the book he wrote, one of the main books he wrote. And the idea was that you could look at an ecological system and you could say, well, what are the elements? Like, who are the consumers? Who are the producers? Where does the energy come from? How does it fit into the ecosystem, et cetera? And so I actually had a slide showing a model like that. But it was a very busy slide. And I thought, well, it's probably a bit beyond, where the audience wants to look at tonight. But I mean, so the first thing would be like, okay, here's somebody who's made this model that I can look at. And a lot of them are documented well enough that you could actually create it fairly easily. But it's a flat, it appears flat. Now it has some interconnectivity, obviously, but it's not shown that way, right? So the first thing would be, how would we systemically model this? Like, how would we alter this particular thing, that we're looking at, and make it in a systemic way, and that it would have closure in 3D. So there's one aspect to it. And then another is that, if we just say that it was a fishery, well, we know that all the fisheries are at capacity or beyond, right? And so there's essentially predation by humans, and there's not enough ecological capacity, right, to restore that fishery to its normal level. So, but within a model, you can start to experiment with methods like it, independently of Bucky's stuff. But what I was suggesting, I didn't really get too far into it this time, is that, you know, when Bucky talked about possible ways systems could connect together, you know, they can connect together at a single point, and he described that as more like what he called a gas. Here, I'm going to just so this is one of David Kosky's models. So he said you could have systems that connect sort of like this. Well, this is like molecules in the gas. They just flow all around and they do all this kind of stuff, and they can do whatever, right? Well, this also, though, unfortunately represents an extractive operation, right? Where I have the rainforest and here I am just sucking the trees out, right? I'm giving nothing back, right? Well, what's the next level up? The next level up is you can have connections at 2 nodes, all right? So now if we have connections at 2 nodes, I'm trying to get the right angle so you can actually see it, you can have, you know, something going out, but also something coming back in, right? And so then I think once you actually do this simple kind of modeling of these interactions, you can see, oh, this one's strictly extractive. Well, then how could we make it more of an exchange, or how could we return something? So intuitively, I know this is true, Una, but I haven't done the work, but I think there's tons of possibilities there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Michael, followed by Joe. Michael.
Thank you very much. During part of your presentation, I noticed the geometric references, and I had not really been aware, you know, of the Hermeticism present in Fuller's work. And also, to me, what seems to be very mystical ideas that he has in regard to design. And, you know, wondered, you know, if he hasn't been influenced somewhat by Western esotericism, you know, in terms of his design philosophies. Just would like your comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's obviously not part of what I was talking about tonight, but yes. I can't think of the artist right now, but we were alerted to the fact that there was an artist going to speak at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles about Bucky and the Bucky Dome. And so he was on the board of the Bucky Dome, and the Bucky Dome was the only dome that he lived in. And it almost was razed, but this Bill Perk guy got together mind to save it, and now there's a foundation that's been restored. So anyway, this fellow that's presenting was talking about it, how he's on the board, and he was in at one time, and he was like, boy, this place is really missing these books, because there's these pictures of Bucky upstairs in the dome, and there's this line of books all around the outside, right? And so then it turns out that in some sort of a cosmic way, the books came back, and he was there to take them and look at them. And he said that the books that had by far the most markups and the most comments in Bucky's hand were the ones that you're talking about, right? They talked about other spiritual traditions, esoteric knowledge, and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of all I know about it. I could probably find a reference for one of his talks and give it to Shrikant. But yes, I think he was quite interested in it. And, you know, he deeply believed in God, not necessarily the God of the Christian church. We just had a discussion on that in the Trim Tap Book Club mailing list. But, you know, he has a book, poetry, I think, No More Secondhand God. And that God was really, you know, what was behind all these generalized principles that made universe work the way it did. So yes, he definitely had a very strong spiritual component. So I think I've kind of danced around your question, but hopefully maybe some of that's helpful.
Sure. I just want to add one thing here. You know, I think transcendentalism has influenced Bucky a great deal.
Yeah.
His aunt was Margaret Fuller, who was, you know, leading thinker in the transcendentalist movement. And it's really interesting. You know, it's like I'm really impressed that Michael caught that theme. And when CJ talked about doing this series, he recommended this kind of fourfold approach to things, 4 on-ramps he called. One is the geometrical on-ramp, which is kind of thinking based. Then there is a collaborative on-ramp, which is kind of working together. And there is the design, concrete design view. And then there is the integrative or holistic view. And different people approach synergetics through all of these 4 things. And I know, Michael, you're new, so if you could look up 52 Living Ideas. Joe, if you could put a link to this Bucky series in there. There are several people who have talked about, these different aspects. So thank you and welcome, Michael. Next up is going to be Joe.
That was a pretty amazing presentation, Curt, and thank you again for doing this each month for us. It's a privilege. The one question I'm kind of wrestling with, and I'm not seeing too much discussion on it with Bucky, is how he would define rational and irrational. I've read a little bit about FM modulation, like frequency modulation and amplitude modulation, and how that's related to conscious and subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one aspect of it I understand. But again, understanding how he would define rational would be kind of important when you're thinking about in terms of design.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're talking about rational in what terms, like, because it's not necessarily something within the constraints of what we're thinking about the current system, because you're trying to impact change, right? You're trying to create change. So how would Bucky kind of define the term rational?
Well, I guess I don't know that off the top of my head. Typically, I go to the Synergetics dictionary and I just start poking around to see what it tells me. I go and see if I find anything in the Synergetics itself. And then I go through the transcript from the, the 42 Hours, Everything I Know lecture. And by the time I've done that, I've got several different little things that relate to it. And it kind of helps me, get a bearing on how to do it. I do think the terms have different meanings for different people. And they're used in terms of the numbers, right? Rational and irrational numbers. And it turns out Bucky wasn't really opposed to irrational numbers, although often, we think he did because of his, question saying pi wasn't how nature designed bubbles, right? But anyway, there's that, and then there's sort of rational economics and irrational economics. What turns out irrational economics are just to put the human in it, right? When I talked about satisficing, essentially, that satisficing says, well, I'm not just making this quote unquote rational decision on saving a dime a gallon on gas because I've got human aspects of, well, I'm going to get home earlier, right? Or whatever else it is. So I don't really know the answer. Yeah, I guess, I'm a little more familiar with metaphysical and physical. And I would say, in terms of the challenge you suggested, he would emphasize that the metaphysical aspects of a future design, would need to work as well as the physical, I think. So yeah, I'm sorry, Joe, I don't have a great answer.
Just
Go ahead, Joe.
Can I respond? I think that's actually the answer right there, the physical and the metaphysical, and you're talking about the generalized principles. I guess that's maybe one way of defining rational. He would look at it as using generalized principles maybe as rational. And then everything else would be, if you were thinking in terms of particulars, you probably would be irrational, because you'd only be thinking within a bounded sense. So maybe that's one way of thinking about it. And I'm just thinking out loud here, so I'm just throwing that out there.
There's also an interesting discussion recently, I guess, at the book discussion. If anybody wants to be on the Trim Tab list, it's a Google group we meet every other Saturday to talk about a book by Bucky or about Bucky. We're in Utopia or Oblivion right now. And somebody had pointed out that they believe Bucky had said that Freud had the most impact of anybody on society. And they're like, why? And that Bucky said it was because he convinced people of the invisible, the power of the invisible, because that's really the most astonishing thing Bucky said was that, you know, as humans, we're only aware of just tiny, 1% of all the energy and information available to us. All the rest is this metaphysical, invisible stuff. And so that he supposedly said that Freud was so important by emphasizing it, even that it really helped Einstein go and figure out his stuff by emphasizing the value of that. Now, we never came to a great conclusion, I would say, in what he actually said and did, but the discussion was consistent with what we understood about his thinking.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, as nobody has, exclamation mark for the next one. So maybe let's pursue the question of, kind of explicit versus implicit, conscious versus unconscious, explicated, identified versus not identified, order versus chaos, because he has very deep ways of approaching these topics.
Oh, yeah.
They are all his own. He has this very independent way of doing that. So on one hand, when you read him, okay, I'm just going to, I don't know that much about Bucky, so I'm just going to talk about what I have seen, and would love to hear anybody who's familiar with Bucky to comment on any aspect of this question about how does Bucky handle explicit versus implicit, conscious versus unconscious, between order versus chaos, known versus unknown. These are all various ways of trying to get at this point. I would say that Bucky has tremendous respect for nature or God, which seems to be the equivalent thing of saying all that there is, all the universal principles that there are. And he has the position of humble ambition in respect to that. Humble in the sense that he's very much upfront about saying that, look, it's much that I don't know, and I am just an experiment. And ambition in the sense that he believes that you should try your best to try to capture in words, try to capture in diagrams as much as you can of the universal principles, and then actually act on it and bring them into and manifest them in the world to make the world better, while continuously remaining open to the possibilities. I love the fact that he talked to everybody, like the range of people that he talked to was quite amazing. And I also like the way in which he talked. So many of folks here have described these 14-hour talks by Bucky, explicating. You can see it in his writing as well. It is a writing of an active, independent mind trying to make sense. So on one hand, it is profoundly rational, extremely precise, trying his best to capture things as well as he can. At the same time, he keeps an eye out. I mean, he says, I love what he said about beauty, that I try not to produce beauty. I try to do work as carefully, as precisely as I can. But if it is not beautiful at the end, I know something has gone wrong somewhere. So he's leveraging his conscious and unconscious in a very deliberate way. So that's what I got, but would love to hear from anybody. We'll start with Michael, followed by Joe. Michael.
So, I'm thinking, that obviously philosophically you need to deal with a tension of opposites, and the things that you're mentioning are opposites. And so the idea is, how do you do that? Okay. And I think that, I could be wrong in regard to my understanding of it, but he somehow believed that a transcendent approach to this, okay, would somehow get beyond that tension, you know, with synergy, right? You know, and the design with nature and the world around us. So I'm just kind of guessing that he would use those as basically the things that he wanted to look back in the rearview mirror and say that had, you know, now become a unity, if you will, within his design principle. Just an idea anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead.
So again, yeah, one of the slides that I really, really liked, and I'm going to have to go back and think about some more, is the Bucky self-disciplines slide that you created. That was like, you know, that was very helpful for me as far as you know, thinking as an individual, thinking comprehensively. One of the things that I did notice on there was the idea of the greatest good. And that was an interesting part of the diagram. And I was wondering if you could actually maybe expand a little bit on what the greatest good, how you would define that a little bit more than as a way of thinking about Bucky's design science.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a risk that I used words that made sense to me that weren't really words that he used. You know, he was very clear though about livingry, right? And that livingry would be not just to, you know, the full expression of livingry would not just bring us to all have our needs met, but would allow us more degrees of freedom to explore things. And most importantly, and this is with, you know, I guess, inspired by or aided by these artifacts that reflect these deep generalized principles, we would understand exactly what our function, our individual function in the universe is. And so I would, you know, just, you know, thinking through that, I would say that, you know, any activity you could engage in to produce artifacts, and artifacts don't have to be physical. I mean, they can be metaphysical, right? Like his world game idea or how he got student teams together, whatever, but anything you do that would essentially enhance the outcome for all the individuals so they could become, you know, they could fully express their individuality. Seems to me that's a, you know, a way of describing how he might have said greatest good. Yeah, but there's the risk I put those words in there just because it was shorthand from me and it wasn't something he said. So
wonderful. So folks, go ahead and type in exclamation mark about anything. I really, you know, Joe, I'm glad you brought that slide up because I thought that was really remarkable, and that's something that we can come back to after everybody has, you know, had a chance to talk. Next up is going to be Jeannie, followed by Mona. Jeannie.
Okay, well, you asked, can you hear me? You
Yes.
asked the question, what would I put in my design science lab? So that got me thinking. And I would like to have all forms of animals there, you know, like, because I think part of our problem is we don't understand ourselves. Animals don't have this problem. They understand themselves at least good enough to exist. Now, there's some problems with having animals in my design science lab because they don't want to be there. I mean, the zoos are, you know, disappearing. We've decided that, you know, this is just absolute cruelty to animals to put them in a zoo. You know, we have people like Jane Goodall living with, you know, apes and stuff like that. Well, that has a, you know, that has an effect on their community that is maybe not so favorable. You know, the way we're using animals now, you know, as the lab animals and that kind of thing, you know, pets are just pampered. It's just our connection with the other forms of life on Earth are just really, really difficult. And the ways that we're examining them at this point are not satisfactory in terms of their lives. So, even I think these cameras in the woods, I mean, how invasive to me, or putting these collars on things, to track them. I mean, how unpleasant. I mean, they know how they look. A dolphin looks at another dolphin, and that dolphin has some stupid thing. I mean, you see the cows in the field with their, numbers hanging from their ears. It's embarrassing. I mean, who wants to look like that? Even an animal has some self-respect. So I think, like, my perfect design lab is impossible, except maybe as a mental experiment. And then I think I'm going out on a limb, because, then I'm putting too much of myself into thinking of how they live or what they want. So I don't know. This is just my problem.
Nice. Well, that's a great challenge, right? And interesting that you came up with those aspects of observation, right? That by observing, you enter their world and you change it, and it's not for their benefit, right? And yeah, I think so. There is one thing there, just Bucky continuously emphasized that we are all observers, and what that means. I mean, way back to the Plato's triad example, right? And what it means to be a good observer, and to think of first principles. And I guess just continue to think out loud. It seems like, Jeannie, you're really using operational style, right, when you're talking about the animals, because you're not using sort of a biological approach or behavioral approach, but you're more thinking about, how are they being, just as an individual or a group of animals, as opposed to how I as a human, right? There's a couple of really interesting books now about this. And the one that I always remember is The View from the Oak. It's an old book now, but I think it's been reprinted. And there's another one, in Thinking Like a Plant. I think that slide I put in there was from Holdridge's Thinking Like a Plant. So people are starting to work on it. It's a hard thing though. Yeah, I read a lot of Bernd Heinrich. He's a naturalist, and he spends a lot of time with animals like ravens and tries to learn as much as he can about them. It's very rich. So yeah, there is a good thing for others, because I did throw that down. What would you have in your design science lab? What would be the things you'd want to have available and study and work towards? So yeah, thanks for getting us back on that track, Jeannie.
Let's do more of that. But Curt, if you could take 2 minutes to talk about the design science lab, so everybody knows what kind of a place it is, and then we can have, and folks would love your answer to that, even if it means just one thing, two things. Go ahead.
Well, sure. I showed the picture of Bucky, with his models, right? And so what did he love to do? He loved to create models. He loved to talk with people about them. He loved to explain them. And it turned out, I think, that he understood that by explaining them, he understood them better. So clearly that was an element of his design science lab. And then, if we talk about Global Solutions Lab, Medard brings them in, he gives them a process. Well, from the one I showed you, I think still from the Design Science Primer, which is available still for free, and puts them in teams, and he presents them with the challenge that generally comes from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. He gives them, a set of resources to work on and some ways to generate possible solutions, and then to come back, to a larger group and present them and get feedback and critique. So that's another way of doing it. If I turn the camera to look at my messy desk over there, you see a messy desk, and it's got a writer's journal where I just sketch ideas, has very few sentences in it, but I sketch ideas about the book and etc. There's a microscope. I've got some hand lenses for looking at things from nature. I've got current books of interest. I've got some modeling stuff. So that's kind of my current one, although clearly I also use the presentation software, and I use writing software, Scrivener, as well. Now, if you talk to Kirby Erner, and I think you had him on a week or two ago, his might be entirely in the computer, right? He's making visualizations. He's using Python, right, to generate the stuff. He's producing teaching materials. So his lab is almost completely computer-based. He loves models, but I generally see him making computer-based stuff. David Koski, like I said, he does a bunch of stuff on paper, but he loves to make physical models, and he makes V-zone models as well. So it's going to vary for different people, but the idea is you have some of these key resources. You have a place in the space that you regularly visit, and you engage in some exploration. And maybe it's just learning, maybe it is design, maybe it's teaching. Yeah, Shrikant, what's in your design science lab?
Well, so there are a couple of things here. The biggest thing in my design science lab are these 52 Living Ideas meetups.
Yeah.
So no matter what I'm designing, what I'm thinking, I like to do meetups only on things that I'm learning. So I try to learn things, and regardless of how little I know about it, I talk about it like I've been doing on the Bible, which I'm not that familiar with. It's very new to me, but I talk about it. The second thing I have is I have these things over here. So this is a dodecahedron and this is a tetrahedron. So I mix these things. These are all together because, and of course I have notebooks where I kind of use just few words in order to, again, draw diagrams and then map them into 3D space. But most of it is, the biggest part for me is this 52 Living Ideas. That is the design lab for me. And it's a very powerful thing because it's active. It is, it gives me a lot. All right. So Joe, can you handle the moderation? I need to take a call.
Sure, no problem at all. So next up, we have, I believe, Mona. Did you go? I believe you're up next.
Yeah, I had a question. I don't know if it's a question, but it's something that's on my mind listening to this talk. This phrase came up quite a bit, that the design principles should be so that it's for the greatest good, right? That it should be good for everyone, for everything. And I keep thinking about this predator-prey dynamic that's everywhere in the world. Like, it's what's good for one is not good for the other. But then there's a dynamic that has to be there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested to know, like, how do we know what's for the greatest good?
Yeah. And I don't know the answer. Do you know about effective altruism?
No, not really.
Okay. So altruism, is serving others, right? And of course, laudable goal, but there's examples of people doing it so much they wreck their own lives. If you try and be completely like Jesus and give everything away, you won't have a house anymore and able to support yourself. So you got to have limits, right? But there is now a thing called effective altruism, and it says, okay, what are the big societal challenges? And so you could pick climate change, you could pick AI, and then they would say, well, how do we study the most effective way you could help with this, right? Like climate change, could you go do modeling? Could you do direct action? Could you change your own life? Could you work with a corporation? So they have material to help you work through it and figure out where you'd get, where your work would have the most impact. So that isn't exactly what Bucky said, but it's interesting. It relates, I think, to what you're saying. The challenges is figuring out, right, what is the greatest good? Because I think we'll find it's like Simon said, right? It's satisficing. It's going to be one of these balancing things, right? If we all had complete freedom and liberty, then we're going to mess some people up, right? They've got to have their own space. We have to have rules and limits. And so it's one of these things I think we just have to work out. I wish I had a better answer. I think each of us, though, we, he has this quote, and I'll mangle it, but it's something like, starting today, if it was just up to me, what could I do, with the abilities I have to make the biggest impact. Bucky had a quote like that. And I think he's challenging all of us to think that there isn't one answer, right? It does come down to, what we have available to us and what we're passionate about and how we connect to it. Yeah, wish I had a better answer, but it's a complicated one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Curt. Next, we'll actually, let's go to read one of Ella's questions from the chat. She is grateful. I don't know if this is an appropriate or applicable question. I am new to Bucky. He seems to have a presumption of goodwill intentions that does not take into account opposites that are concrete barriers. For example, the same forces that oppose cure for diseases and greatest good sacrificed for hyper-economic interest. Does his concept apply to social change, such as enhancing collective behaviors to stop viruses and pandemics, transforming medical systems of care patients sacrificed to serve the medical and mental health industry and profit, reduced life expectancy, starvation, etc.? Unmasking across hospitals, naming and killing the disabled is another example. Medical industrial complex, mental health industrial complex, more designed to serve itself than patients humanely in many patients' experiences. Prison industrial complex, it is realistic to think that there is a design to reverse the inhumanity, or I guess it's supposed to be inhumanity. If the inhumanity, lack of compassion and empathy is the system's problem that needs correction. The question, there's a lot of questions here, but can the lack of systemic and societal care be corrected, and is necessary before or at the same time any other concrete issue can be addressed, I'm assuming. What would Bucky say? So just to summarize, I mean, that's a very, very long and complex question that, in the chat. So I guess in a way, the gist of the question is, I guess how to make the greatest impact. What are some of the, is profit part of the issue? And how would you go about upending some of these systems that Ella has talked about in the chat here? I know there were quite a few questions there, so the questions are in the chat, but I mean, maybe a generalized answer would be sufficient.
Sure. So it kind of dovetails with the previous one, which is, what can I do? You remember, there was a slide that said, what shall I do? And so I think the biggest thing Bucky gave us is the example, right, of individual working, for what he considered the greatest good, able to support himself and a family. Okay, so I think, he gave us that example that, we could do it. We didn't have to take terrible bad jobs. There was a way to support yourself. So that was the thing he gave us. And then he gave us these points of view and what I'll call the tools. We've mentioned them briefly. The system change toolbox includes this idea of trim tab, the trim tab being, the little rudder on the rudder. So if you trim tab a big rudder, you can move a much larger ship. And so then that's used across all the stuff you mentioned, Ellie, by people in the system saying, how can I change the direction of this big ship, right? Because I can't change the ship, but I want to change the direction. So this is the trim tab kind of a thing. And the next one is precession, or what I call systems coupling. That's these two-way, there's always two-way interchanges. And so we, as individuals, strive towards these, right? If you have somebody that wants to consider you a friend, but they just talk and talk and talk and never listen to you, it's not a mutual exchange, right? It's not sustainable. So we know intuitively how these things work. And the same with a job. If a job is just taking and taking and taking, right, we know it's not sustainable as well. So so he gave us these tools, and well, third one is what he called creating a new model. Don't fight the existing system, create a new model. And I think that's a framework for things like what are called the commons rules that Eleanor Ostrom observed. There's this idea of the tragedy of the commons, that unless the commons is regulated, that the individuals will just keep taking and taking until they wreck, this joint property. They'll each add an extra cow, right, until there's no more grass left for anybody. But Eleanor went around and studied these societies and said, well, actually, as long as people are in charge of the commons, they do a pretty good job of managing it. It's only when we get them out of the picture, right, and let the big bad guys like the corporations in, that they abuse the commons because they're just doing it for profit, and they're faceless, right? They're not connected into us, if you will. So he gave us tools that can be used towards those things. The other thing I would say is that he did have a strong feeling about, corporations. There's a brief piece, not brief, but a shortish piece called Brunch of Giants, where he showed that the corporations have basically done things to take money away from the individuals, and this is a very tragic thing. I don't think he felt that he could fight it. And, he's very famous for saying we're better off doing designs of new things than engaging in politics, because politics is trying to change like a fixed, bunch of stuff. Whereas in design, we can actually make more and more happen, right, through design activities. And so it's been criticized, of course, by many, but it's, I think, a good point to be made for those who might be considering two alternatives. Like, well, if I work with design towards creating new alternatives, I may be more effective than trying to legislate for change on a personal basis. I mean, the legislation still has to happen, right? And I want to support it. I'll do whatever I can to support it, but maybe that's not my key job. Bucky emphasized that, find out where you can have the greatest impact. And often it would be in, creating these new opportunities and new ways of connecting and being. So once again, not a great answer, but basically, I think his goal was to give us tools that as we each engaged, with the world, we'd be very able to do it, and, to empower us to act in ways that helped everybody out, that if we could.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Curt. Next up, I have Michael. But Michael, I'm going to give preference to people who haven't gone yet, if that's okay with you. So we'll go with Paul, Maggie, and then we'll follow up with Michael.
Hi, listening to Mona's question and your answer, Curt, I want to ask a follow-up question, which is, is it possible to use Bucky's techniques to answer her question? Like, treat it as a design science question. So, we want to build something or other in a way that's in sync with the greater good. So now we have a design question. Well, to answer the design question, we have to define the greater good. So is it built into his system to answer the question, maybe by invoking the principles of the regenerative eternal universe or something? So I just wanted to bring that to you to hear your comments on it.
Yeah, that's a great framing of it. And I would say that, there is a number of processes that are out there today. We talked a little bit about them in the comprehensive lecture. So design thinking is, known as human-centered design, and it's used in industry to make products. It's also used for all kinds of social innovations. And so the Stanford Innovation Lab and a whole bunch of Acumen and a whole bunch of other places use it. And what they do is they engage with people who have a lot bigger challenges than those of us on this call probably do, right? They don't have maybe adequate nutrition and healthcare, and et cetera. And so they use design thinking to deliberately engage with those people to find out more about the actual need before they go off and start designing it. In the same way, I think the rich picture, which is part of a systems approach, would also emphasize, we start with the people and find out what's really important to the people. So this isn't basic Bucky, but I think it's complementary, and Bucky's ideas on comprehensivity can actually enhance these approaches to it. So I like your proposal. And I think Bucky's ideas on comprehensivity, anticipatory, even design science could aid this process to finding out, what is actually the best thing for this group today.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Next up we have Meg.
Hi. On the topic of our labs, it occurred to me while you were talking that I think I just live in my lab. I never even thought of it that way. But I have everything that I like to experiment with. I have my 3D printer, I have my sewing machine, I have machines that I have deconstructed just in case I might be able to use it for parts. I have a treadmill that I can walk on while I watch YouTube videos about best soldering techniques. I have sketch pads and all that kind of stuff. And it never occurred to me that that was a lab. That was just me collecting like a little magpie, all the stuff I wanted to help learn how to do this stuff. I am very curious about everyone else's labs as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so that's anything more on that would be great. And I meet up with a couple of people who are doing their own explorations of stuff, and they explain how one is actually working through material and writing up these very brief, concise notes called Zettelkasten. I get it wrong all the time. Another one makes these displays where he actually makes a presentation and prints it out and puts up like, science project, these 3-part boards, and he explores learning theory and stuff. And so it's good to talk to other people about it. So thanks very much, Maggie, for bringing that up.
That's great. So appreciate that question, Maggie. I think one of the things that coming back to maybe what Jeannie had talked about, I don't see any other hands up or any exclamation points in chat. Let me just double check that. I don't. Maybe what? Oh, Michael, forgive me. I just overlooked. Forgive me. Sorry about that. I was looking in the chat there for a minute. Go ahead, Michael. Forgive me.
Oh, no problem at all. I lowered my hand, but the question of, what constitutes the greatest good and how Buckminster Fuller would frame that is very interesting to me, especially in the light of the current trend of futurism towards long-termism. And so the question is, would Buckminster Fuller put this as the greatest good in terms of the world that exists now, or a world that we would then imagine in a future potential that we would not choose the greatest good for now, but choose the greatest good for the future in terms of attention that would be present within his ideas and resolve. Now, I don't think that I can definitively, even myself, I have no chance of guessing whether or not Buckminster Fuller would have embraced long-termism or not explicitly, okay? But I'm somebody that doesn't like long-termism, okay? I'm just being honest with you. I don't think it's ethical, frankly. That it's an ends justifying the means type of, idea about things. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in. Would Buckminster Fuller have said that the greatest good could never be achieved by the ends justifying the means? That's kind of what I'm wondering about, because long-termism seems to imply that that's the case.
Yeah, I like it, and I'll just say, Joe, get it to Shrikant. I think this is a great idea for a future chat. I'm just a little bit familiar with long-termism, and I've also heard critiques of effective altruism. And I think a discussion, where somebody would present sort of the basics, Michael probably can do long-termism and somebody could do EA, and then tying it into Bucky would be very useful. Of course, the other one is going to be AI, right? So in a way, Bucky would love AI because guess what? It's this compilation of all the knowledge of all the people, but it's not ethical, right? It's not like a human that went through training to learn about people and being nice, right? It just knows how to put words together in a way. So it's completely intellectual. and divorced from any aspect of caring or etc. So it's this really two-edged thing, right? Isn't it? So another great topic would be Bucky and AI. And I don't think any answers would come out of it necessarily, but I think it'd be very interesting. So thanks, Michael. I don't really have an answer, but I've also seen a little bit about long-termism, and I share some concerns, but I don't know enough really to comment.
Yeah, actually, I think that would be a great topic to explore a little bit further. Michael, actually, do you have a follow-up? Were you going to say anything? Or no? Okay.
Yeah, to me, it's within, the question is important to me because there's people that are saying, well, we should make data-driven system decisions. Okay, so in other words, we have policies based on these data-driven decisions. However, the framework of the policy is often not completely transparent as far as, well, it's data-driven and the claims made and the policies based on that. But what is really the greatest good? Is it a data-driven decision? I would say that we would have to define that. And often we're just told, well, this is a decision made off the data. It's a scientific decision, therefore it's good. So there would be no framework basically of what would be considered ethical or good. We would just be told what the policy is. And that's what I'm concerned about in the future, is of how policy is going to be made as far as affecting our future. That's why I'm concerned about this, is what is the greatest good? And really trying to understand that, because I think it's going to be a huge debate, in the near future.
Right. Yeah. So I love it. And Ellie, I don't disagree with your comment that you could tell the AI, act like a therapist, and it's going to do a good job, right? You can also say, act like you want to give this person a bad experience, and it would willingly do it, right? It doesn't have that human element of saying, oh no, Ellie, I'm not going to do that. At least the ones we have currently built, just the way they've trained them. There's no training, the way a human spends years, right, of learning how to fit in or whatever. So it's a two-edged sword. So, okay, back to Joe. We got people asking questions.
Yeah, we got a couple of people in the chat. I just would like to take maybe a little bit of crack at this, just from one perspective. I would comment, and I know very little about Bucky compared to many of the people on the call, but I think that Bucky looks at things as regenerative. So not necessarily long-term or short-term, is that how does the system replenish itself? And there are a lot of examples of that. So something that is self-sustaining. And so I don't necessarily think that there's a length of time that's associated with that. It's more or less looking at what are your values, and then how is something going to sustain itself over a period of time. And that could be in the short term and long term. So maybe I think it has more to do with regenerative economics. It could also, Curt had mentioned Eleanor Ostrom's papers as well. So she touches upon this, but I wouldn't necessarily categorize that. I would think I would stay away from categorizing what Bucky would actually say regarding long-termism or short-termism. I think it's more of a sustainability approach that he would take towards design. That's my opinion. That may not be everybody else's. So what does a sustainable system mean? I can provide some examples of that a little bit later, actually, but we'll go to Jeannie and Paul.
Well, Joe, you stole my two words, sustainability and regenerative. So, but I was thinking the sustainability movement came up about the same time as Bucky, but did he use that word? I'm not sure. He did? I don't know. You don't know? Anyway, I don't have more to say. That you said it well, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. So next we'll go to Paul.
Yeah, a few things. I'll talk about what might be in my lab, but also before that, to finish my thought on this topic. Curt brought up a really good point when I talked about the greater good and Mona's question, that there's design thinking that's sort of parallel and sympathetic with Bucky, but maybe not directly from him, where you actually learn from an audience what their definition of the greater good is. And so that's key, because when you include the people in the Rust Belt who work in the coal mines every day and their entire living is dependent on it, you get the balance that might be lost otherwise. So I'd like to think that Bucky would or we can be sympathetic with his concepts, to use a joint definition of the greater good to drive decisions, as opposed to only long-term or only short-term. That's one thought. But in my lab would be some software tools that might use AI to look at all the little branching diagrams Curt showed us. It's hard to navigate the 1,400 pages, the 7-hour interviews. So I want to see AI that takes a design question and sort of puts through this filter, here's the most important Bucky concepts to think about. That would be in my lab, as well as some music stuff, because I'm very interested in sound and how you could embody a tetrahedron as a set of sounds and things like that. All right, those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Well, signaling is one of the most important things with tuning. So, Curt.
Oh, that's great. Yep, I thought of that too. We could have an active thing right now saying, okay, AI, what's the best way to, do regenerative agriculture, right? What are the best approaches? And we could be continually doing this right now. And then there could be an activity to publish it. And I don't know if it would influence anybody, but I think the advantage of it is that we have the possibility the AI is perceived as neutral, right? And so then if we ask challenging questions and we get these answers, right, which of course might be sciencey, but maybe they'll be perceived as more neutral and get us slightly out of the polarization. I mean, so there is a possible future thing we could do, just building on Paul's idea. So.
Thank you for the question, Paul. Mona, you're up next.
Yes, I wanted to talk about my design lab as well. In my design lab, there's poetry, and I was thinking about that tetrahedron that included beauty, truth, and there was another thing I forgot: symmetry and the self. So I'm thinking about that because in deciding what's for the greatest good, I don't know an answer, but when I think of a poem, and something just stirs inside of me and just comes out, and I don't know where it comes from. It's not necessarily rational. It doesn't exclude rationality, but I may trust that even though I don't know what is actually for the greatest good. But then that's something that I have that's part of that tetrahedron that recognizes beauty and symmetry and truth. And that's as good as it gets for me.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you, Mona.
I've been reading books recently about how, poetry really is sort of that emergent thing. It reveals something that's not obvious to us, right? And Bucky, of course, he wrote his long poems, and he was actually the professor of poetry right at Harvard for a while, so he would agree with that. So, well, thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful. I look forward to any further thoughts on your design science lab. I'm going to put my email in the chat or anything related to the talk. Once again, if you ever want to be on the list for the book club, happy to do that. And Joe, thanks for helping out here, and great to see everybody.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah,
I'm definitely going to send you my lab. It's Stoic cosmopolitanism is going to be part of it. So I'll
all
send
right.
that to you.
I like it.
I'll turn it over to Shrikant.
All right. So are we wrapping up? What's the situation, Joe?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Yeah, I mean, 2 hours under the spotlight is
perfect,
great, but I
perfect.
mean,
All right. Thank
know,
you. Thank you very much,
all
Curt.
good.
And thank you for Joe for filling in. And thank you, everybody. Wonderful. And Curt, I really like your presentations, and we would love to have you continue after you finish the chapter 4. It is going to accelerate your book, and whatever feedback that we can give, really appreciate that. Would love that book to be out there sooner than later. So thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you all.
Bye.
See you soon.